Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to our first ever breakfast crowdcast. We've got our friends David Rubenstein and Christina Greer here for an encore conversation. And we're delighted to have them both back. And I'll tell you more about them in just a moment. I'm not going to talk for too long. I know I'm not what you came to hear, but I do want to just point out a few features of the Crowdcast. If you haven't used it before, please chat happily and freely in the chat area, as some of you are doing already. That's part of the fun of these virtual events. But toward the end of our program, we are going to be doing a Q&A. And if you could do me the favor of posing your questions for David and Christina in the Ask a Question area that you see at the bottom of your screen, rather than posting them in the chat, that'll make that part of the program look just a lot more easily and smoothly. So thank you for that. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I ask you to just lift your eyeballs a little bit and look at that long green bar that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. Truer words were never spoke. We have done a lot of hard work to make it through COVID, as so many organizations and institutions have done. We've really stayed connected with our audience through these crowdcasts that we've provided, sometimes 3 or more a week, but it hasn't been free, and we are always kind of hoping for support wherever we can find it. So if you are able to donate anything by clicking on that green button, $5, $15, whatever you can manage, know that every single penny is put to very, very good use, and every single penny is deeply appreciated by the staff and board of the museum. Another thing I'd like to point out to you is the link in the chat through which you can purchase a signed copy of David Rubenstein's new book, The American Experiment, which we'll be talking about this morning. Now, we know that you can purchase that book elsewhere, but if you purchase through us, know, first of all, that you do get a signed copy, and also know that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. And again, we appreciate that very, very much. So having said all that, I'd like to introduce our guests, but first I'd like to thank our sponsors. This program, like so many of our programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Ward. So Dr. Christina Greer is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University, Lincoln Center Manhattan campus. Her research and teaching focus on American politics, Black ethnic politics, urban politics, quantitative methods, Congress, New York City, and New York State politics, campaigns and elections, and public opinion. Her book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, investigates the increasingly ethnically diverse Black populations in the US from Africa and the Caribbean. David M. Rubenstein is co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful investment firms. Mr. Rubenstein is chairman of the boards of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Economic Club of Washington. Mr. Rubenstein is an original signer of the Giving Pledge and a recipient of the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy and the MoMA's David Rockefeller Award. He's the host of Bloomberg Wealth with David Rubenstein on Bloomberg TV and the David Rubenstein Show on Bloomberg TV and PBS. Welcome both of you again. So great to see you both.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's our pleasure as always. Christina, will you let me know when it's time for me to pop back on and help with the questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And thank you, David, for joining us again. I'm super excited to discuss the American Experiment. We were together, I guess, at the beginning of the year, talking about your other great book, How to Lead. And we enjoyed the conversation so much. I really appreciate you coming back to the Twain House so we can dive into this book. I have so many questions, and I want to get your thoughts on so many things. But first things first, how have you been? We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. You hanging in there? Obviously still being very productive, putting us all to shame.
Well, I'm doing okay. I'm still in my main house in Washington, but I have been traveling recently. What I would like to say at the outset that in my last book, How to Lead, I had an interview with Colin Powell. Colin Powell was a good friend of mine. I've known him or knew him for many, many years. And as the Kennedy Center was going to celebrate or commemorate, I shouldn't say celebrate, commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I called him and asked if he would speak at that event. I knew that he'd had multiple myeloma, and I knew that he was not as good shape as I wished he had been. But he told me that he was staying low and staying at his house, and really wasn't making a lot of speeches, but he told me he would do this speech. And he did come. I talked to him in the green room and with him and his daughter, Linda. And he actually said that his cancer was in remission or equivalent of that. And he was feeling pretty good, obviously careful because of COVID. And he went out and made a very good speech, got a standing ovation, not surprisingly. And sadly, COVID took over. That was his last public speech. And, he's an incredible role model for so many people of all backgrounds. And I got a chance to work with him over the years in various business matters, and just an incredible person. It's really a sad situation that he's no longer with us.
Oh, David, I really appreciate that reflection. I mean, yesterday I was shocked at actually how sad I was. And as I talked to a lot of my friends, my generation is the generation that knows him through the Bush years. And that's sort of our first and foremost, but sorry, I live in New York City. But I talk about Colin Powell in my book, Black Ethnics, because his parents were immigrants from Jamaica. And this nuanced understanding of Black identity in the United States, in many ways, he talked about being a child of immigrants and what that meant to be a Black person, but also an immigrant. And I just did a show before our meeting this morning, and I'll never forget when Barack Obama was running for the presidency in 2008. And there were lots of accusations that he was a Muslim. And on more conservative outlets, they were accusing Barack Obama, the candidate, of being a Muslim. And I remember Colin Powell saying, all the Democrats kept saying, no, he's not a Muslim. Don't worry, he's not a Muslim. And I remember Colin Powell saying, what if he is? Okay, he's not, but what if he is, right? We are a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of diverse people, Jewish, Muslim, what you name it, atheists. And we can have diversity in all senses. And I thought that really shifted the conversation during that presidential election. And he was just a man of grace and dignity in a lot of ways.
Yes, I mean, Colin was a person who obviously suffered racial discrimination. There's stories in his wonderful book, My American Journey, about how he had to go to the back of a restaurant to get food when he was serving in the military and trying to get food off the base. And as a man that he understood racial tensions. He tolerated it in the sense that he understood what the situation was, but never carried it in a way that I think offended people, in a sense that he was very able to get along with whites, blacks, every ethnicity, and just a real role model for people. I interviewed him not long ago about leadership at Mount Vernon, of all places, where we talked about the roles that generals and others play in civilian life. And he was just a remarkable person who had a disposition to want to get things done and to like people. And he had some great skills, as you probably know or read about him. His Yiddish skills were quite considerable. He had worked for a Jewish businessman in New York when he was growing up, and he developed quite a vocabulary of Yiddish, much better than mine.
Well, I'm looking at he's in the commander section of the book we discussed last time, with Presidents George Bush and Bill Clinton, General Colin Powell, General David Petraeus, Condoleezza Rice, and James Baker III. So for our viewers out there, if you haven't picked up How to Lead, you can get it through the Twain House or wherever you get your books. David, I want to shift to your new book. And I'm so appreciative that you write these books for us to give us a window into these really interesting icons. And I'll get into that in a moment. But can you talk to me first about the title? The title of my book, I just call it Black Ethnics, but it's Black Ethnics. I'm a political scientist, so it has to be a colon, race, immigration, and the pursuit of the American dream. And a lot of the book is really trying to get at what the American dream means for African Americans or people of African descent, not just descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, but Black immigrants as well. And so can you talk to us a little bit more about why you chose to call it the American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream?
Well, when this country was created, and I mean created through the Constitutional Convention, obviously for hundreds of years before that, this country had occupants. Clearly, we had Native Americans, and then before the country had the Constitution, we had the colonies and so forth. But when the Constitution was created in 1787, we basically had an experiment in democracy. There had never been a country which said, let's have a representative democracy. When countries are formed, you usually had an autocrat or a king or someone like that running it. And basically, there was no representative democracy. This Constitutional Convention said, let's have a representative democracy. It was an experiment. And many people didn't think it would work. Thomas Jefferson thought maybe it would last 20 years, and maybe that was the most we could expect. In the end, it obviously has lasted almost 250 years with lots of changes, lots of challenges. As we all know, the biggest impediment to the experiment going forward, it turns out in hindsight, was the willingness of the founding fathers to tolerate and in effect sanction slavery. Sanction in the sense that they let it survive. And that was something that led to the Civil War, and that was our greatest stress test. The country almost fell apart and could well have fallen apart over that. Since that time, we've had many stress tests on this American experiment. The Vietnam War, Watergate, the events of January 6th. All of these have been stress tests, which our country has survived. And I've said in the book that I think it survived and has prospered and done much better than the founding fathers might have thought, because we have certain genes inherent in America, and these genes have come together to enable us to survive. Among them are the belief in the rule of law, the belief in equality, the belief in diversity, the belief in the importance of voting, and so forth. And so the book is really about the trajectory from the beginning of the country and the fights we've had to kind of keep this experiment alive through fights for racial integration and racial equality, gender equality, sexual preference equality, things like that, all throughout this country's history.
Well, this isn't the talk. We're going to discuss your book, but at some point I would love to discuss these stress tests, because I teach Intro to Politics every semester, and I point out all the Easter eggs that are hidden in the Constitution. We read Federalist 51, separation of powers and checks and balances, but I'm a touch worried about the stress test that we're in right now, or recovering from with the Trump administration. So maybe we'll schedule another talk for you to come to the Twain House.
Well, one thing I talk about in terms of racial issues, and obviously you're an expert in that, is that the thing that has always struck me as so amazing about this is that the human brain is the most amazing thing that's on the face of the earth. When humans first appeared out of caves in the 400,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, it wasn't evident to probably the gorillas and the elephants and the tigers that we would conquer the earth in the sense of controlling everything, because we weren't as fast, as big, or whatever as other creatures. I'm sure the elephants and others looked around and said, who are these little people and how long are they going to survive? Well, we survived and we prospered and we conquered the earth. And we did it because the human brain is the most incredible thing that anybody has ever seen. You can create great plays, you can go to the moon, you can discover cures for all kinds of diseases. Yet the brain has this incredible problem in that it says, if you have a different look than I do, if you're a different race than I do, I don't have to like you as much as I like people from my own race. And therefore, throughout history, there's been racial tensions between people of different ethnicities, even though the human brain is so wonderful that it can create Shakespearean plays or other wonderful things, yet we still seem to have something wrong in the brain that enables many people to think that you are not as good as me if you look different than me. It's very hard for me to understand why the brain has that fallacy, but it obviously does.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure some neuroscientists are trying to figure out how we can possibly reprogram to get more progress in a different way. David, I want to ask you, I was looking at these interviews with icons, and so you say, and the summary of the book and the reviews of the book are always, David has these amazing conversations with icons. And I want to know, how do you define an icon? How are you selecting these people for these projects?
Well, when I interview people, I interview many people. And then ultimately, as you know, when you're doing interviews, sometimes the interview turns out not to be as good as you once thought it was going to be. Sometimes it turns out to be better than you thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. And in the end, for any book I do, if I interviewed, let's say 40 or 50 people, the publisher in the end says there's only space for 30 people. So I have to blame the publisher and say to my friends I've interviewed, you didn't make it in the book. My publisher is the one that's responsible for that, because I don't want to say, the interview wasn't that good. I blame the publisher. But to be very serious, I'm trying to get people who are a wide swath of life, different backgrounds, different experiences. In this case, I've interviewed historians, but also people who have lived the American dream in many cases, people that rose up from modest circumstances and have lived some of the principles that I'm talking about in the book.
Well, how do you feel this book differs from How to Lead? I mean, I know How to Lead, you've got the CEOs and the founders and game changers, but in many ways, they're icons as well. What are some of the similarities and differences between the two books in either the selection process or how you view your subjects?
Leadership is a subject that's taught all over the world. And so many people around the world have been interested in how to lead because the same principles that apply to leaders in this country probably apply to leaders outside of this country. So many people around the world are probably more interested in a book in leadership than a book in maybe American history. Many people around the world would say, well, Americans, you have your history, it's nice, but we want to focus on our country's history. So it probably doesn't have quite the span across the globe that a book on leadership would have. And of course, people, when they read books on leadership, when you have a title like How to Lead, people believe that if they read the book, they can become a leader. And in the end, it's probably more than just reading a book that makes you a leader. Maybe it can inspire you, but in the end, you got to do more than read a book to become a leader.
Yeah, I'm amazed at the number of books in the bookshops that just have a whole section on how to become a leader, right? We know that David Rubenstein is incredibly successful. Be like him. Read these, 200 pages and all of a sudden it will miraculously happen.
Yeah, the world doesn't quite work that way, but the hope that any of us have, and you're a professor, why do you teach people? Well, you hope to inspire them to do something with their lives that's useful. And why do you write? For the same purpose. So any author is always trying to get an audience that will be inspired by what is written and hopefully have some impact. A book on how to lead might inspire some people to do things differently, but by itself isn't going to make somebody a leader. My next book is coming out next year, and it's on about investing. I've interviewed the greatest investors in the world. Now, just reading that book isn't going to make you wealthy. It might inspire you to learn some of the secrets of investors, but you're not going to get rich and be a great investor just by reading the book.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So I know not to just pick up the book and all of a sudden assume that through osmosis, I'll have great investments.
No, it doesn't work quite that way.
Okay. So you dedicated this book to public servants who protect our democracy. Can you expand on that?
Yes. The stress test of the post-election period of time and January 6th was one of the greatest stress tests our country has gone through. It wasn't 100% certain that the results would come out the way that they did. We had 65 lawsuits filed by President Trump and or his supporters, and 65 of them were dismissed pretty much out of hand because the only fraud found was the fraud in the allegations being made by those suing. There was no real fraud of any consequence. But it wasn't clear to people at the beginning that would be the result. You have judges who are appointed by Republican governors or Republican presidents, and they were willing to say, no, this is not right, and there is no fraud here. That took courage, in my view. Particularly, it took courage when election officials, not judges, but election officials in certain states said in Pennsylvania or Georgia, no, there was no fraud here, and I'm going to uphold the election as we have counted it and not succumb to political pressure. So I really dedicate the book to the people who made it possible for us to get through this difficult period of time. And when you think about it, it is amazing that we have so many talented public servants making relatively modest amounts of money. A member of Congress, for example, is paid $174,000 a year, hasn't had a salary increase in about 20 years. 85 members of Congress live in their house offices because they can't afford to have a separate house in Washington. Federal judges make, close to that, but not much more than that. The idea that you get people who are so distinguished serve as federal judges making modest amounts of money, relatively speaking, given their stature, it is amazing that we get so many good people and we have so little corruption, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, in New York, we've got a teeny bit of corruption going on. We're trying to weed it out. But thinking about all of our public servants who go to Albany diligently every week, and they're barely making $80,000 for the amount of work that they do and the issues that they're grappling with. It's remarkable. And you mentioned me being a professor. I mean, part of my job isn't just helping inspire them to figure out what they want to do, but also planting the seeds of public service in their minds. If they're interested in a particular topic, helping them see that, they too could and should run for office at the local or state or federal level to contribute to the democracy that they want to see.
Yes, there's no doubt that what you're trying to do as a professor is inspire people to do something with their lives that might make the world a slightly better place or make their lives more important.
Right. Well, while we're on this topic of protecting the democracy in this stress test, I know how I feel about it, but I want to get your thoughts. How did you feel about Donald Trump not attending the inauguration of Joe Biden?
We've had presidents before not attend their successors' inauguration. John Adams was famously upset that Thomas Jefferson, his vice president, became president. So he left town the day of the inauguration and basically didn't attend. So it's not unprecedented. I would say, it'd be more graceful to attend and to congratulate someone, but it was clear that President Trump was not going to accept the results of the election. And by attending his successor's inauguration, I think he felt it would imply that he did accept the legitimacy of the inauguration. So I'm not surprised that he didn't do it. I wished he would have done so, though I think it would have been better for our country.
Right. Okay, I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but do you have a favorite section of the book? I will admit my two favorite sections are sections 5 and chapters 5 and 6 of the book. I loved the section on creation and culture, and I loved the section on becoming and belonging.
Well, just like asking somebody that has 3 children, which of your children do you like the most? I think I'll deflect that and basically say that I like all of the sections, but I think some of them where people talk about their lives, people that have lived the American dream are ones that I think are compelling to me, at least. So you have a great baseball player, Cal Ripken, a great.
Oh, we're going to get to that.
Or Rita Moreno, or a great artist, Wynton Marsalis, a great performing artist, people like that. So when you hear their human stories, I think those are pretty compelling.
Right. And I asked you this about the last book, but is there anything that surprised you the most when writing this particular book?
I was probably surprised at how many people recognized that while this country has had so many challenges, racial tensions and other things, it's still a country that people don't want to leave. We have 800,000 immigrants coming in legally every year, become citizens. We have 47 million immigrants in this country. Very few people are leaving the country, and no other country in the world has anything close to the number of people we have as people want to be in this country. And so when you think about it, the American dream, while it isn't really applicable to many people in our country because they are so mired in poverty or other problems, many people still believe this is the greatest beacon of freedom and the greatest place in which one can pursue their ambitions. So it's still a great country despite all of the challenges we have.
Absolutely. I mean, and to paraphrase James Baldwin, I mean, he says to be critical of this nation is one of the most patriotic things that we can do. It means, we're still in the fight. We care. We want it to be better. And that's why we sort of point things out, these pressure points of the nation that have existed and continue to exist today.
Yes. I had a survey done in preparation for this book by the Harris Corporation. And what it found is, interestingly, the right that Americans most cherish in this country is not necessarily the right to vote, but it is the right to free speech. 65% of Americans said that is the most important thing that they cherish about this country, the right to free speech. So just as James Baldwin is saying, that doesn't mean that I hate my country by criticizing it. It just means I want to exercise my right to say what I want to say and not fear that I'm going to be killed because of it.
Right. I always remind my students that sometimes we take that for granted when we see, what's going on, the transitions in Afghanistan or various countries where not even just journalists, but, students speaking out against their government don't have the same rights and privileges and freedoms. And we sometimes tend to forget that, in the vein of Mark Twain, we do have this luxury to do so.
Yes. Very few constitutions actually guarantee the right to free speech. Ours initially didn't because we didn't have the Bill of Rights. But when the Bill of Rights was attached to the Constitution after a few years, it really guaranteed, in effect, that the government wouldn't interfere with the right to free speech.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think Twain would make of this book, since we're at the Mark Twain house virtually?
Well, Mark Twain would probably say it wasn't funny enough because he had a great sense of humor, though he has written books that were not necessarily humorous as well. So one always hopes that somebody like Mark Twain, if he could come down from heaven or read it from heaven, would say, hey, not a bad job. I could have done better. But, for what you are, it's not so bad. As
Right.
we discussed last time, as the chairman of the Kennedy Center, we honor Mark Twain every year with an award for comedy. At times, people have suggested to us that we honor members of Congress because so many times what they're doing is so funny, sadly. But in the end, we don't do that. We tend to find professional comedians and we tend to honor them. And that's been a great thing for us. So we're very happy that Mark Twain has existed. There's a new biography, I guess it'll be coming out soon on him that I'm looking forward to reading by one of our great biographers.
Oh, fantastic. Who are you all honoring this year?
We haven't announced it this year because of COVID. We didn't do it this year, and we haven't announced the person we'll honor next year, but we're working on it. And if you have any good suggestions, let me know.
All right. Well, let's talk offline. I've got lots of suggestions.
The last time we honored somebody, I think the last time we actually had the award was, I think it was Dave Chappelle.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been in the news a little bit lately, but, it was well received, let's say.
Absolutely. Well, I can't wait for you all to be back in person so we can support and cheer you on, because it's such a great honor that you all put together. I mean, obviously, we talked about this last time when we were in the throes of COVID in a different way, and it was before the vaccine was sort of widely available, and we were still pretty much locked in our homes, and the need and the necessity for comedy and laughter in these times.
Well, if you like our honoree when we announce the next year, call me and I'll have you come as my guest for the festivities. It's pretty good.
David, this is being recorded. I'm coming. Don't worry. It doesn't matter who. Well, it doesn't matter who it is.
Okay. All right. We'll have a very good event, and we have the best event is not actually only the show, but we have a rehearsal dinner, so-called, where people can say things off the record that's even funnier than what they can say on TV. So come to that.
Last year when you said that, Jennifer and I decided that we're coming together. So our people will talk to your people.
You're all welcome to come. You'll have a great time there.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to get into just a few chapters before we open it up for Q&A. So the first, there were three that I chose that I just found really powerful. The first was Jon Meacham on John Lewis. And this is John Lewis's biographer. And you all spoke several times. And so what was it like interviewing a biographer who had just recently lost the subject of his work? Because it was pretty touching, and I felt like you were very kind in understanding there was a level of pain that he was still processing through the loss of John Lewis.
Yes, Jon Meacham wrote a book basically about John Lewis's life as a civil rights leader when he was very young. When he gave the speech on the March on Washington in August of 1963, John Lewis was only 23 years old, the youngest person to speak there. So he was very young, and then he went on to a distinguished congressional career for 30 years, but Jon Meacham didn't want to focus on that. He wanted to focus on what took this son of a sharecropper away from his home in Alabama and basically made him into a preacher and also into a civil rights icon, and somebody was dismissed as a civil rights icon at some point by Stokely Carmichael, who defeated him for leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then how he had to remake his life. It's a very interesting life, and the interview was done by Jon Meacham of John Lewis, knowing that John Lewis was probably not going to survive very long. He had pancreatic cancer, and sadly, pancreatic cancer is one of the most deadly types of cancer you can get, because typically you don't know you have it until you're in stage 4. And at that point, it's very difficult to stop them metastasizing. So as a result, I think Jon Meacham knew that John Lewis would not survive very long, but clearly it was sad for him when John Lewis did pass away shortly after the book was more or less completed.
Right. I mean, do you have any thoughts on, you mentioned members of Congress. How do you think we can really move voting rights legislation through to honor John Lewis? It seems like it should be so easy and so basic, and it clearly is not. From your vantage point, which is slightly different from many, what do you see as
Remember, the original Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and it was renewed essentially every 5 years or so. And the last time it was renewed essentially with no dissent because there was no opposition to it. In the last 5 years or so, it has been recognized by some people that if minorities get the right to vote, they might not vote for how some people who are in control of certain things want them to vote. And so we've been struggling in the last couple of years with making certain that people have the right to vote. And really, it's a sad situation that we've retrogressed, in my view. For example, in the new Texas law, voting rights laws, if you want to have a write-in ballot, you have to drop it off at an appropriate place. There is one place in Harris County, which is Houston, that you can drop off your ballot. One place. And what's the likelihood of people being able to drive across a large city or a large county like Harris County and find this one place? It's obviously designed not to allow people to have write-in votes. And it's often, at the view of many people, that write-in votes are often done by people who are minorities. Why? Because minorities don't have as much control over their schedule. They might not be able to get away from work during regular voting hours and so forth. And so it's a sad situation where we have a constitution that guarantees more or less the right to vote, but now we have legislation that effectively takes that away in many cases. It's a very sad situation, and I don't think it's getting better. I think many southern states have now followed the lead, and just other states that are controlled by Republican voters and Republican legislatures are thinking that this is a way that they can hold on to power a bit, because it's clear that the country has changed. In 1960, this country, when John Kennedy was elected president, 90% of the people in this country were white, 10% were non-white, and most of that 10% was African American. Now, 60% of the country is white and 40% is not. And the percentages are going to change over the next 20 years or so. So majority will be non-white. Well, if you're white and you are not happy with what you see being done by governments, and you think, well, these are minority voters putting these leaders in, you're going to try to thwart that voting. And that's essentially what's happened when you cut through everything. That's really what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, we as political scientists always have the demographics and destiny conversation, and reading the literature of Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight and the work they're doing in states across the country, because so many people of color identify with the Democratic Party because of the social safety net, their views on equity, the fact that they're not following, sort of white supremacist ideology, they seem to be galvanizing more voters. But as the Democratic Party seems to increase the number of young people and people of color, it seems the laws are getting stricter and harder for them to participate, and the costs to voting seem to increase each election cycle.
Yes. And think about it. The party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, was the party that African Americans largely supported to the extent they had the right to vote before the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was opposed by many Republicans, and ultimately the black voters became more Democratic voters than Republican voters, and we have this big shift. Somebody who my children don't remember the time because they weren't alive when the Democrats controlled the South. Now the Republicans largely control the South, and so it's largely over one issue, which is race, and the right of certain minorities to get what they think they deserve and probably do deserve is just the thing that has caused enormous racial tension in this country. It's not as bad as it was during the Civil War when we had slavery, but it's not as good as it was at other times in the country either.
Absolutely. If you're interested in maps, I always use this website called livingroomcandidate.org. It shows old ads that my students love, just campaign ads from Eisenhower to the present. But the best part of livingroomcandidate.org is it shows the map. And so the candidate, the vote that they received, the percentage of the vote, and then the number of electoral college votes. And it's, portrayed in red and blue, sometimes gray when we have George Wallace. But you can see the sort of the inflection point elections where, Nixon sweeps, when
Right.
California moves from being red to being blue, Texas sort of flip-flopping before it turns red. And then obviously the swing states over time.
Well, interestingly, I'm filming a PBS series, and for part of it, I went to a symbol of some part of the Confederacy called Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain is in Atlanta, and for much of the 20th century, there was an effort to carve Confederate leaders on Stone Mountain. And ultimately, Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee were carved on it. At the dedication of that in 1970, who showed up? The Vice President of the United States came to commemorate that Confederate leaders were being put on the Stone Mountain. I mean, it's amazing how the world has changed in some respects. People recognize that that's probably not an appropriate thing to do anymore, but those generals are still on that mountain. Not that easy to get them erased from it. And I would say that one of the surprising things in recent years, the last year or so, is that the murder of George Floyd had a greater impact on the country than the lynchings of thousands of people and the murders of other people who weren't captured on video. Think about it. One man was killed, a terrible killing, but we've made some real progress since then. People are much more sensitive to these issues than they were, I would say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when we still had lots and lots of challenges to racial equality. It's not perfect by any means now, but we have made some progress since the murder of George Floyd. People are much more sensitive to these issues than they were before.
Yeah, I mean, David, the reason why I like talking to you is because I think we need to have these kind of like inflection point conversations. Because I agree with you. I think some people are a lot more in tune to it, and they've doubled down and recognized that this country is filled with inequities. And I think, sadly, that we have a segment of the population that has seen it several times and is now decided that they're going to be immune to it, and it will not affect them in any way, shape, or form or capacity. And if anything, they're doubling down in the opposite direction, which is what concerns me.
What people like generally is to have power and control over their lives. And what we've seen is that many people, I would say many of them are white, have felt that as racial minorities become more and more powerful, their power, the white power, is being reduced. And to some extent, a lot of what we see on January the 6th and other kinds of events and things like that are really efforts by, I would say, some parts of the white power base to hold on to power and not to want to recognize that the growing population is becoming more and more non-white, and not recognize that more and more power should go to people that are not white. And that is to a large extent what we see going on in some of these events, in my view.
Yeah, and competition, right? So it's like you had years and decades and centuries of no competition, and now here you are. You're competing with women, you're competing with people of color. It reminds me of Archie Bunker in some ways. Did you ever watch All in the Family?
Of course.
I was afraid of the show when I was a kid because Archie Bunker sort of scared me. But what I found fascinating was he was angry that George Jefferson and Louise, the Jeffersons, moved into his neighborhood. But he was furious when they moved out of his neighborhood to go to the Upper East Side. And so this feeling like the country is slipping away, that you're being left behind, is a large part of the crux of some of this conversation.
You know,
For whites.
Norman Rockwell wrote, or not wrote, but he had kind of art about what the American life was like in the so-called 1940s or 50s and so forth, a kind of idyllic life for white people. And that life that white people kind of look on favorably as a memory of the 1940s or 50s or even 60s is slipping away. And some people are just not willing to recognize that the country is changing and the population is changing, and you can't hold in the power forever if you don't have the majority of the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears ever so slightly because you know how I feel about Baltimore, and I know that you're a son of Baltimore, so we have to talk about Cal Ripken really quickly before I bring Jennifer back in. What would your childhood self say to sitting down interviewing Cal Ripken, who I'm a personal fan of Cal Ripken on a host of levels? What did inner David feel when you sat down with Cal Ripken to talk about his career, his successes? I mean, and he's one of these athletes that's done a lot on the field, but quite a bit off the field as well.
In the most of the 20th century, people looked up to athletic heroes, and we didn't focus on their personal foibles and their indiscretions and other challenges they might have had in their own lives. And so now we know much more that some of these athletes were not exactly paragons of virtue off the court or off the baseball field. Cal Ripken, by contrast, is somebody who is a paragon of virtue. No scandals, no problems in terms of his off the field life. He lived a life where he was a perfect baseball player, essentially one of the most talented players ever. And yet he also was a role model. No drug scandals. He gave back to the community. He's still dedicated to teaching people baseball. So he's a real role model for people and the kind of person I wish we had more of. So I really enjoyed meeting with him. I hadn't known him before and interviewing him. And you think about it, he created some records that are not likely to be broken anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Were you a baseball fan as a kid?
I was. I grew up in Baltimore, as you point out. In Baltimore, the Orioles were pretty good. They won a number of World Series. We had some great players, Hall of Famers. And so, yes, I was a big fan of the Orioles and still like to see them do better than they're doing now, for sure.
I was about to say, I don't know, David. They're struggling a little bit.
Well, this past year, they had the worst record in Major League Baseball, which was not good. So obviously, we have some progress to make.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, David. I'm going to bring Jennifer in. And just as Jennifer is coming in, I wanted you mentioned this, but I wanted you to just talk to us a teeny bit more. The next book you're working on is about folks who are investing. Tell us just a touch more.
Yes. Well, everybody wants to make money as an investor, I suppose. How do you do that? It's not that easy. It's like anything. You have to really know what you're doing. And so I thought by interviewing the greatest investors in the world, it would unveil some of the secrets that these people have. And so it's designed to kind of inspire people to want to learn more about the art of investing, but also to admire the people that have really done it quite well.
Great. Thank you so much. Jennifer, welcome back.
Thank you. I didn't want to come back because I just wanted to listen to the two of you keep on talking forever and ever. So it's such a privilege to hear such engaged, incredibly intelligent people. So thank you for all of you shared. So David, we don't actually have a lot of audience questions. I think everybody has felt the same way I have, which is just kind of hanging on every word. But I have a question, and it has to do with, your book is The American Experiment, and in science, experiments are meant to be designed so they can be replicated by others, right?
Yes.
So that brought to mind the question, are there still, or were there ever, I'm sure there were, but I'm getting at America's role in the world and how the rest of the world looks at America now versus how they might have in the past. And do you have anything you can say about that?
Well, I think after World War II, the United States dominated the world in every phase, military, political, economic, technology, and so forth. We were almost 50% of the entire world's GDP. And people looked at us not only for our military power, but also our democratic government. And they admired what we had produced. I would say today, the American image is not as good overseas. People saying, well, you have riots like January 6th. How can you ask us to follow you? You deny people the right to vote, clearly. How can we follow you? So I'm not sure we're quite as inspirational to people around the world as we once were. But our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence were documents that did inspire revolutions and changes in government around the world. And clearly, there are many democratic governments today that got their start by following some of the things we did in the United States. In recent years, it's been the case that the United States, because of the America First effort, or whatever you want to call it, has lost some of its, I would say, allure to some people around the world. And I don't think it's going to be easy to get back, honestly.
Christina, do you have anything you'd add to that?
No, but I have an odd question that I'm curious about. And I can't remember if I asked you this last time, David, but can you tell me who your favorite president is and why? Largely because when you were talking about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, it made me think of my favorite president, who's hands down LBJ. And whenever I teach Intro to Politics, which is every semester, I ask my students to identify a personal favorite, recognizing that none of these men were perfect, just as much as they can choose a series of policies that they really love and admire. A large percentage of the American public or the world would disagree with them for a host of reasons. When I say I love LBJ, lots of folks who were in the Vietnam War would fundamentally disagree with me. Obviously, I think about the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Act, and all of the work that he did to essentially, trick members of Congress into signing on to this legislation. But you mentioned, sort of Thomas Jefferson and Adams really briefly, but I want to know if you had a favorite president, either modern day or from the past.
Well, in my view of the presidents we've had, there's one that stands out above all the rest, and there's probably another one is number two. Number one, in my view, without doubt, is Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
It wasn't clear to me then that any other person other than Abraham Lincoln would have said, I'm not going to let the South secede. I'm going to make sure the Union stays together. Now, what would have happened had the South seceded and we let it get away? Well, the United States wouldn't be the country it is today. Slavery would have probably existed for a long time beyond 1865. And so I think he made the right decision despite the horrors of the Civil War. And his humility, his grace in speaking in a certain way, I would say were qualities that you just have to admire. After him, I guess the first president would be the one who set the role model for everybody else. And the fact that he had so many other consequential things he did, which is to win the Revolutionary War as a general, preside over the Constitutional Convention, make George Washington number two, I would say. Number three is more challenging, but I would say if you were to look at all the presidents of the 20th century, for example, the most impactful one would have been FDR because he was president the longest period of time and got us through both the Great Depression and also World War II. So those would be the ones I would cite probably.
Gotcha.
Thank you. So Gail Rosenfeld in our audience wants to know what was the biggest surprise from Mr. Rubenstein that he took from his interviews for the book? Anything surprising?
Well, the biggest surprise, I guess, is that people are willing to talk about some of these subjects that are very personal. Many of the people I interviewed are talking about their own failings, insecurities, challenges they've had in life. Anybody that you know as a great person always will have some challenges. Everybody struggles in life. So the interesting people that I interviewed, they've all had their challenges, their frustrations in life. And one of the reasons I think it's interesting to interview great people is that when they open up and say, well, I'm not perfect. I made this mistake. I had this failing. I wish I had done this better. It does make them a little bit more human and maybe can inspire other people to realize it's not possible to be a perfect person. And you will always have challenges. You have to overcome those challenges. Rita Moreno is a very interesting person, a great actress, but she revealed to me and to others that she tried to commit suicide. She was living with Marlon Brando, a famously faithless partner, and she couldn't put up with his infidelities and tried to commit suicide and barely failed to do so. She almost succeeded. Talking about that publicly is probably not an easy thing to do, but she did.
Wow, that's a really good example. Gail, thanks for that great question. Peter Roos, our executive director, is here in the audience this morning. He'd like to have you expand on the stress testing of our democracy idea.
Well, when we went through the Great Recession, the federal government kind of came up with the phrase stress test, to stress test the banks and to see whether they could survive in certain cases. And so I've used that phrase to kind of assess our democracy and the challenges we've had to it. And the greatest stress test in most recent times, of course, I think are the steal of the election, or whatever you want to call it, and the January 6th events, a real stress test. And let me tell you how close it came to succeeding. For example, let's suppose the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, had said, look, I'm getting a lot of pressure. I'm just not going to show up on the Senate. I'm not going to read the votes, or I'm not going to certify them. I'm just not going to do it. Well, it might well have gone to the House of Representatives. Under our Constitution, if the Senate cannot come up with a leader to be elected through the Electoral College method, it goes to the House, and each House delegation gets one vote. While there are more Democrats in the House than Republicans, there are more Republican delegations than there are Democratic ones. So had it gone to the House, Donald Trump certainly would have been reelected, despite the fact that he lost by 7 million votes, in my view. So I do think that that was a real stress test and a real challenge. I think if you read Bob Woodward's most recent book, there are a number of heroes in it. One of them is General Milley, who did some incredible things to keep the country, let's say, in a sane position for a while. And then Mike Pence, while he might not have wanted to be a hero in quite the way that he turned out to be, by not agreeing to do what Donald Trump wanted him to do, I do think he emerges as a hero.
Thank you. Christina, would you like to add anything to what David just said?
I'm still processing the trauma that was the Trump administration, and really thinking about David, I want to get your thoughts on, I guess, this administration. Some people have called it a bridge administration to take us in a new direction, one way or the other. How can you sort of extrapolate based on what you just said, how you feel about this particular administration moving us forward in some values and principles that you deem are necessary for American democracy?
Well, a couple of challenges. The current administration has to recognize that it doesn't have, and it obviously knows, the power that other presidents have had who are new presidents. For example, when Lyndon Johnson was elected in 1964, and he then pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, he had 2/3 majorities in the House and the Senate, 2/3 majorities. There were 68 Democratic senators. So when you have those kind of majorities, you can get a lot more done. Right now, Joe Biden doesn't have any majorities of any consequence in either the House or Senate, and there's a realistic chance that he could lose the control of the Congress. So it's a much more tenuous situation than it was, I'd say, years ago. FDR had the same situation, in massive Democratic control of the House and Senate. So that's not to diminish what those presidents did, but it's to point out that Biden has a tough time, much tougher time getting legislation through. And I think he'll have to recognize the need to compromise to get anything through the Congress. I do think he'll get the infrastructure bill through, and he'll get spending bill through. And I think on the spending bill, people should recognize what's going on. Over the next 10 years, the budget of the United States will roughly be $100 trillion, $100 trillion, roughly an average of $10 trillion a year on average over the next 10 years. Right now, it's about $7 trillion. It'll go up. We're talking about an increase, whether you like it or not, of 1.8 trillion, 2.3 trillion, or 3.5 trillion, which is, something like 1.8% or 2% or 3%. It's not, it hasn't been sold, in my view, very well. Whether you like all the things in it or not, it's still de minimis relative to the $100 trillion budget we're going to have over the next 10 years. We've gotten to this habit in Washington of having budgets of 10 years. And the reason we do that is because when you pass a tax cut or a tax increase, you don't want to say it's not going to have some positive effect for the country. And so let's suppose you're going to have a tax cut and you say, well, it's going to reduce revenues in years 1, 2, and 3, but because greater economic growth in years 7, 8, 9, it'll come back and be paid for. But when you stretch out things over 10 years, it doesn't really work. Nobody does their household budget on 10 years. Nobody runs a company on 10-year budgets, but we're running the federal government on 10-year budgets. So we're pushing everything down the road. That's led to enormous deficits, in my view. But in any event, I would say that Joe Biden has a lot of challenges. He's not a young man, though I think 78 is younger than it seemed to me many years ago. But he's obviously got to deal with whether he'll run for re-election again and the challenges of Donald Trump possibly running against him again. So not an easy situation.
Yeah, really quickly, I saw something online the other day essentially saying, I apologize to all the 40-year-olds that I called mad old when I was 18, and I'm now starting to feel that. Jennifer, do you mind if I just ask David one more question that I had that I didn't get to before we brought you in?
We have plenty of time, so please do. I think the audience has asked this question, so please do.
So David, your Doug Brinkley chapter on the race to the moon. Have you spoken to other astronauts or folks who work on this type of outer space? Let's see. Folks who are interested in our explorations to space. Have you spoken to them about sort of Branson and Bezos and their tourism and their races to space, coupled with the conversation about climate change and all the things that we need to do here on Earth? I have some very, very strong feelings about billionaires racing to space and what's happening to regular folks here on Earth and what we're doing in space and what we're doing to the environment when we have boys and their toys. Can you sort of talk to us about your interview with Doug Brinkley and some thoughts on this race to not just the moon, but obviously the space race that we're in?
I have interviewed actually at the Space Museum in Washington. I interviewed one time Michael Collins and Jeff Bezos together and talked about space. Michael Collins went on the original mission to the moon. I would say that if you talk to most astronauts or people that care about space, they are not upset about boys and their toys because they would say they believe in space and they want to get something done. And the federal government has basically absented itself from that. So let's suppose you didn't have Richard Branson or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. Where would we be? Would we be having any federal NASA program getting us to the moon or the Mars? Probably not, because of the cost and so forth. So I would say most of the astronauts or people in the space industry, they would say, well, do something to get somewhere. And if the federal government's not going to do it, the private sector can do it. I recognize that people back on Earth who are not as connected to the space program would say, well, why should rich people decide where we're going to go and do outer space kinds of things? I understand the argument, but the federal government is not doing very much right now. And the private sector seems to be filling the void. So I personally am not upset about it, though I recognize that it is unfortunate that only rich people seem to be able to focus on this issue now, and the federal government does not.
Yeah, I think I have lots of issues about sort of billionaires. I just feel like, after $1 billion, you just get a certificate that says, you won capitalism, good for you. And then, figure out how we can reallocate these funds. But I think the timing this summer was frustrating for me as we saw so many people worried about eviction and food shortages. And I get that we need to continue our space program because the government is strapped. But I also feel like the government might be strapped because we have the Elon Musk and the Jeff Bezos is not contributing their fair share to the larger pie. What do you say to that argument?
I don't know what their current tax payments are, and I can't get into what they paid or not paid. But there's no doubt that throughout our country's history, many great devices and services have been led by people who are wealthy people who created great companies. So I'm not saying the world would fall apart, but if we didn't have Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and similar companies, would we be better off as a country or be worse off? I don't know, but I think some of these services are now indispensable. And we think that we like these, and they were created by people who have turned out to be extremely wealthy people. So in the end, you can't take your money with you. So most of these wealthy people recognize you got to do something with it, and they tend to have different things they want to do. I recognize the challenges of letting people do whatever they want with their money, but I obviously am somewhat biased in that category. I think people who have made money should be able to do some useful things with it, but I don't want to say that what they're doing is not useful. I think that, for example, the NASA was so expensive because every time we would send a rocket up, it would never be reusable again. Now we have a program where you can reuse these rockets, and that's probably a good advance in technology. But in the end, we should recognize that people who have money are going to figure out some ways to do something different, creative, and take advantage of their money to advance some parts of civilization. I don't know how to address their tax situation, but that's beyond my control.
Okay, great.
And David, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that you yourself have been very generous and philanthropic in your role as a wealthier person than either Christina or I is. So I feel we need to make that clear.
Yeah, I was an original signer. There were 40 of us at the beginning of the Giving Pledge, and I've resolved to try to give away all my money. I'm in the process of doing it. Hopefully I'll live long enough to do that.
Well,
thank you. We appreciate it. And we really appreciate you spending time with us here at the Twain Museum.
Thank you
so much.
Every time we talk, and I think I'm partial to you largely because you're from Baltimore. I just like people from Baltimore. The third person, I wish the two of us could have Twain at the table. I think that he'd enjoy our chats and would really push both of us to think about the country just a little differently.
Well, as you know, it may be true that his death is premature. He may be around somewhere. You never know. And maybe we'll both pop up and have a chance to meet with him at some time.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope if that happens, it happens at his home here in Hartford. We'd love to have you back, Christina, and we'd love to have you come visit us, as you know, David. And I just very quickly want to point out that if you enjoyed this program, tonight we've got Cappy McGarr talking about his new book, The Man Who Made Mark Twain Famous. And of course, he's the co-founder of the Mark Twain American Humor Award prize. So people can tune in this evening at 7 on Crowdcast if they want to take part in that. Thank you
Yes.
both so much for spending your morning with us.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to
And-
interview Cappy about his book at the Kennedy Center in, I think it's November. And
Oh, very good.
so anyway, thank you all very much. My pleasure.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thanks a lot.
David.
Buy
Bye.
the book.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Christina.
I think we're
That was
still streaming.